Hello movie barfs, and welcome back to the channel. It's no surprise that Avengers Endgame had many emotional highs and lows throughout the film. After all, it's Marvel's epic conclusion to 3 phases of movies spanning over 10 years. Safe to say, this was the MCU entry that caused the most tears shed in cinemas. Whether it was Tony sacrificing himself with the snap, or Steve reuniting with Peggy and finally being able to have their dance, or the funeral scene where everyone watches as Tony's body sails away, Avengers Endgame had no shortage of tear-jerking moments. But while all of those are fine, there's one scene which I personally find to have even more of an emotional impact than those. It's not anything dramatic or saddening. In fact, most of the vibe around the scene appears comical and lighthearted at first. Well, I won't bury the lead anymore, it's this scene. The one where Tony Stark bumps into his dad Howard when he goes back to 1970 to retrieve the Tesseract. Yeah, it starts off in a comical manner. Tony bumps into his dad, something he wasn't expecting to happen, and so he's at a loss for words. At first glance, it might seem that Howard was written into this portion of the film to bring some tension, to serve as some obstacle that would make Tony's Tesseract heist a little tougher. But as it went on, the scene started to show more depth. Emotional depth. It's not just the fact that Tony was almost caught trying to get away with the Space Stone, or about him having to come up with a silly name on the spot and making small chit-chat on his way out. Ultimately, this scene is about a son finding some form of reconciliation with his estranged father. It's about a son finding out that the father who's been cold towards him all his life actually loves him and wants him not to make the same mistakes he did. Throughout various MCU entries, we learn of Tony's strained relationship with his father, Howard Stark. This was the most prominent in Iron Man 2, where Tony mentions that his father has never loved him and that his happiest day was sending him off to boarding school. In Tony's words, he was cold, he was calculating, he never told me he loved me, he never even told me he liked me. I mean, even as he's watching his video archive, it's as if he can't bear to look at his father for fear of triggering unhappy memories. And when we reach the point where it becomes Howard's personal recorded message to Tony, and Howard starts addressing Tony directly in the video, we can still see that Tony is defensive and skeptical from his facial expression and body language. Fast forward to Civil War, we get a brief flashback of an argument between a teenage Tony and an older Howard shortly before his death at the hands of the Winter Soldier. We see how abrasive their relationship was with their exchange of sarcastic quips and witty insults. But the thing is, that was just a simulated version. It's how Tony wished it happened. The true version was probably more contentious, a huge fallout with both father and son saying something hurtful they probably regretted. It must have been a memory that Tony was struggling with. Something that he was fighting to accept, even after all those years. As he said, this memory represents unprocessed grief. Well, here in Avengers Endgame, with the ability to jump timelines, Tony is now standing before his dad in the flesh. In fact, he's probably older than his dad is in this current time. I like that he was so stunned that he forgot to take his briefcase along, the whole reason why he needed to enter this timeline in the first place. After exchanging pleasantries, Tony realizes that he has yet to be born, and that his mother is expecting him. At this point, Tony brings up the fact that he himself has a daughter, and just look at his expression here. It's almost as if he's longing to tell Howard that that's his granddaughter, but he can't for obvious reasons. He just has to silently contain that excitement, and Robert Downey Jr.'s acting here is absolutely on point. It's a perfect mixture of nervousness and excitement, coupled with restraint. It's one of the reasons why this scene is so endearing and why I feel it has an emotional punch. Howard then shares that he'd prefer a baby girl, as she would have less of a chance of turning out like himself, someone whose self-interests take precedent over the greater good. Now, bear with me here, but this reminds me of the scene in Spider-Man Homecoming, where Tony is lecturing Peter after his mess up at the ferry. Peter tells Tony he was trying to be like him, to which Tony replies, "And I wanted you to be better." And immediately Tony follows up with, "Gosh, I sound like my dad." So when you put two and two together, this scene in Endgame with the one in Homecoming I just mentioned, it must have been the case that while Tony was growing up, Howard was constantly fearful that he'd become self-centered like him. And perhaps when Tony eventually did become a textbook narcissist, it disappointed Howard, so he constantly told him that he wants him to be better. It isn't said explicitly, but at this point, I'd like to think that maybe Tony realizes that Howard was strict with him because he was afraid that his own character flaws would be passed down to him. Howard was regretful of his own selfishness, and he meant well when he was just trying to keep Tony off this path, to keep him from becoming as self-centered as he was and having to regret it later on in life. That strict upbringing was not because Howard didn't love him or like him as Tony said, but it was done out of protection and care, to keep him from following in his mistakes. Howard then allows himself to be vulnerable before Tony, and opens up regarding his insecurities about becoming a parent, which leads to the both of them reminiscing about how their own fathers treated them. Howard recalls his own upbringing, where, in his own words, his old man never met a problem he couldn't solve with a belt. And that's when Tony realizes that while he felt his dad was tough on him, it was nothing compared to what Howard went through. While he remembers that he was cold and calculative, he realizes it wasn't fully Howard's fault. He was a victim of a tough upbringing too, so maybe that was all he could draw on. Maybe that was all he knew of how to raise his son. Maybe his own troubles with his dad affected the way he related to his own son. Tony realizes that Howard did his best given the circumstances, and that his best was enough for him. He then hears from Howard what probably are the most loving words he's ever heard from his dad, that although his kid isn't born yet, there's nothing he wouldn't do for him. You can tell Tony wasn't expecting that. He's clearly stumped by that declaration and has to take some time to process it. He's so into the moment that when Steve beckons to him, seemingly to check on him, he kinda gives this annoyed look as if to tell Steve to piss off. Tony discovers that while his dad never said it blatantly, while he was never affectionate or loving outwardly, Howard did love him in his own way and was willing to do anything for him. I think this is the first time in his life that Tony realizes that he was truly loved by his dad. It's somewhat sad that it came so late. Remember, he's probably older than Howard is at this point, but at the same time, it's heartwarming that it did happen eventually. Right before they part ways, Tony reassures Howard that everything's gonna be alright before giving him an awkward hug. This part of the scene is so complex because you can tell how caged Tony must feel. He's drowning in an ocean of emotions, and yet he can't show any of it to Howard for obvious reasons. I bet he would have wanted to just tell Howard everything, but he just can't. I bet he wanted that hug to last much longer than it did, but it couldn't. When he says, "Thank you for everything," you know he wants to end the sentence and leave it as that, but he has to hide his affection by following up with the words, "for everything you've done for this country." It was awkward and hilarious and touching, all at the same time. It was a son reconciling with his dad in a most strange way, and yet Howard is clueless as to what's going on. And the best part was that from Howard's point of view, it's just a friendly chat between two strangers meeting for the first time. It's amusing that Tony got more out of his dad as a stranger than he ever did from all those years as his son. If only Howard could get a glimpse of how much this encounter meant to Tony. This moment was the closing arc for Tony's relationship with his dad. Next to bringing everyone back from the snap, this was the greatest gift that time travel had for Tony. These short few minutes gave Tony all the closure he needed concerning his dad. It reminds me of the scene in Flashpoint where Bruce gets a letter from Thomas Wayne when the Flash goes back to an alternate timeline. Another case of a father reaffirming his love for his son through time travel. Tony never got the chance to say goodbye to Howard since he was killed, but this is where he gets his chance. Tony Stark is one of the MCU's most endearing characters, and his relationship with his father is, in my opinion, what humanizes him the most. No amount of money ever bought a second of time, and no amount of Tony's billions can make up for the fact that at the end of the day, he's still a son who, like everyone else, needs the love of his father. This is why this scene is my favorite in Avengers Endgame. It's just a simple exchange of words at the surface, but it means so much more in the context of their father and son relationship. I've rewatched this portion of the movie more than any other segment, and I feel it's more emotionally significant than any of the other supposedly tear-jerking scenes. Tony sacrificing himself and Steve going back in time is all good and all, but over time, it kinda loses its impact when we read that both Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans are going to return to the MCU, probably as an AI hologram for Tony. All the casualties in Infinity War and Endgame lose any meaning when they can be revived just like that. But this scene, this reconciliation between a father and son, its emotional impact will still remain, even if Tony Stark is somehow written back into the MCU. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.